They couldn't see us, but we saw everything. That phrase carried weight in the dark belly of the USS Callahan's Combat Information Center. Inside, the room pulsed with a quiet urgency, lit only by the green glow of radar scopes and plotting boards. Young sailors, barely out of their teens, were hunched over their screens like monks at ancient altars, headphones clamped tight, murmuring data into boom microphones while officers hovered behind them, eyes locked on the rotating radar screens and grease pencil plots of enemy positions. Outside, the Pacific night was an ink-black curtain, hiding the American task force as it crept west of Okinawa. But inside, the Callahan saw everything. Seaman First Class. Jack Sparky Rohr sat cross-legged at his radar console, eyes glued to the phosphorescent display. Every few seconds, a ghostly white sweep circled clockwise. Usually the screen was clean, just the ship's own halo and a few friendly signals from nearby vessels. But tonight, something shimmered faintly on the edge of the scope. Multiple distant contacts, not scheduled, not friendly. Rohr keyed his mic and reported, "Multiple unidentified contacts, Sector 040, range 32,000 yards and closing." Lieutenant Commander Mason, the tactical action officer, looked up from the central plotting table. He ordered confirmation of the range and classification. Rohr adjusted the gain. The echoes were faint but persistent, 5 of them, moving together in formation. Too organized, too clean for anything but enemy ships. Mason's jaw tightened as he instructed further tracking. The Combat Information Center fell into a focused quiet. The Callahan, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was a fast but lightly armored ship meant to screen for the heavier carriers. Tonight, it was about to take the brunt. Inside the CIC, time seemed to slow. The electronic hum, the rhythmic pencil strokes, and the radar's steady sweep were a mechanical heartbeat. Then the enemy signals accelerated. The radar showed the contacts increasing speed, closing fast at flank, bearing steady. The watch officer traced lines on the transparent plotting surface. They were headed directly for the destroyer line. Mason ordered the information relayed to operations and a direct line opened to the flag on the carrier Lexington. Within seconds, the warning rippled across the task force. Up on deck, it was still all darkness, but below, in the CIC, the picture was unmistakable. Enemy vessels, likely Japanese, had slipped through the screen. Now, under 20,000 yards, their proximity hinted at more than just luck. Either they'd guessed the American formation, or they had radar too. "It could be a torpedo run," suggested Ensign Brody, his voice low. Mason didn't disagree. He ordered a vector plot. The angle was 75 degrees starboard, a textbook approach for a night torpedo pattern. Brody confirmed they weren't just probing, they were charging. Mason ordered general quarters. The alarm blared. Red lights snapped on. Above, sailors sprinted to their stations. The Callahan came alive. Guns were readied, eyes sharp, but it wasn't human sight that mattered. It was the radar. Rohr reported the enemy at 18,000 yards. Still no radar emissions from them. That was the clue. They didn't know they'd been spotted. Mason muttered that they had the advantage of first eyes. Captain Thurston confirmed the CIC's data and angled the destroyer to open up the forward guns without overexposing the ship. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Strike first, strike fast, and hit where they least expected. In radar-directed combat, there were no flares or spotlights, just coordinates and fire control equations. At 15,000 yards, the CIC locked on. Rohr called the shot. Bearing 1045, range 14,500. He recommended opening fire. A second later, the 5-inch guns barked. The shells vanished into the night, but to the radar men, they were clear as math. The first target was hit. Rohr shouted the confirmation, his voice shaking with adrenaline. The first contact faded from the scope, disabled or sinking. Mason ordered the second target engaged. Brody already had it marked, bearing 042, range 13,000. The fire was adjusted 2 mils to port, elevation corrected, and another salvo launched. This one struck home too, judging by the radar flash, a possible engine room hit. But then, new contacts. Fast, low-flying, inbound from the northwest. Roar yelled a warning. Aircraft, not torpedoes, coming in low. Brody muttered that it was a coordinated attack. Surface ships to distract, aircraft to kill. Mason had it relayed to command. Above decks, the lookouts were shouting now. Black silhouettes were visible, skimming the water. The CIC prepared for dual threats. Surface contacts remained priority, but close-in weapons and gunners were assigned to air defense. The Callahan was now caught in a layered ambush. The radar tried to track everything. Ships, planes, and even a submarine contact blipping off the starboard bow. It was the kind of chaos radar was designed for, but only if the operators could stay calm. Suddenly, Roar's screen began to flicker. Jamming, static. He reported loss of contact with 2 enemy echoes. The enemy was using short-range electronic interference. Basic, but effective. Brody hissed that they were trying to blind the Callahan. They knew they'd been seen first, and now they were trying to strip away that advantage. Mason snapped orders to switch to backup frequencies and analog filters. One tech flipped the radar into alternate mode, tuning it manually like an old ham radio. Sparks flew. Time was running out, but they weren't blind yet. The men weren't just observing. They were fighting alongside their machines. Contact was regained through narrowband filtering, and Roar reported the ghost signal returning. Surface Echo 3 had turned away, retreating. Brody's voice showed relief. They'd struck the lead ship and thrown the formation into disarray. But the kamikazes didn't panic. The crew in the CIC felt the shift before they heard it, a tremor in the hull followed by the eruption of anti-aircraft guns above. The radar had given them an edge, but now survival would come down to steel and fire. The first kamikaze came in low, skimming the waves so closely that it barely registered on radar. Roar had tuned the gain carefully, filtering out sea clutter and isolating the unnatural motion. The target approached at bearing 310, altitude low, speed 210 knots, descending fast. That wasn't reconnaissance. It was a threat. Mason didn't wait. He ordered all batteries to fire immediately and relayed elevation and descent angle to Mount 52. Brody passed the data along quickly. Above, the dual-purpose 5-inch guns opened up, joined by the pounding of 40mm Bofors and 20mm Oerlikons. Tracers stitched across the sky. The CIC couldn't see any of it, but they understood the rhythm. They conducted the defense without ever seeing the stage. A second aircraft appeared on radar, bearing 305, range 3,000 yards and closing. It was targeting the next ship in line, probably the Ludke. Mason reached for ship-to-ship communications and issued a warning to the Ludke's CIC, recommending a hard starboard turn and full anti-air sweep. The reply came quickly. They saw the bogey and were engaging. Roar reported the radar return disintegrating, likely from impact or a confirmed kill. The Callahan shuddered as a blast echoed across the water. A fireball lit up the starboard sky, visible through the CIC's view slits. Brody confirmed the enemy plane was down, debris falling astern. Even as one kamikaze fell, the second closed in on the Ludke. Roar's screen showed a split blip, either radar scatter or the aircraft breaking apart mid-air. The truth came from a lookout. The Ludke had been hit midship and was on fire. Roar winced, clutching his console. She hadn't turned sharply enough. Mason leaned over the plotting board, identifying more surface contacts sweeping in from the west, likely mop-up boats, counting on the kamikazes to weaken the destroyer line. Brody added that these boats were there to finish off the survivors. The CIC shifted gears again. Radar wasn't just passively observing, it was directing fire, marking survivors, assigning sectors to gunners, and alerting nearby ships. Mason ordered all batteries to track surface threats. Mount 51 focused on a contact bearing 270-Echo 5. The contact was moving at 15 knots and possibly laying smoke. Roar confirmed the attempt to blind their radar. Brody responded that with the target's vector known, they could fire through the smoke. Mason gave the order to engage using radar targeting. The kamikaze attack had diminished, leaving behind smoke, wreckage, and men. CIC relayed that the Ludke had lost power and had fires on deck. She was listing. Brody reported seeing survivors overboard, dozens of them. Even through the steel shell of the Callahan, the human cost was unmistakable. A destroyer might stay in the fight for 20 minutes after a hit. A man in the water had maybe 5. Mason called for sonar and radar sweeps, plotting drift vectors to locate every possible survivor. A fresh acetate sheet was pulled over the plotting board. Low-speed surface echoes could indicate rafts, swimmers, or even floating debris. Roar adjusted the fine gain on the radar. Despite the choppy sea, 3 main clusters were forming, drifting southwest. The torpedo threat remained, so the Callahan couldn't stop its engines. Brody noted that they could still mark locations, and Mason ordered them to do just that. The CIC lit up with coordination. Positions were plotted, estimates updated with wind, drift, and current. For 30 minutes, the radar tracked not enemies, but survivors. Every irregular return might be a sailor clinging to life. Fletcher called in over the radio, saying it was moving in to sweep survivors. Roar responded, suggesting an approach vector to counter drift. Brody warned of a possible enemy PT boat near one of the survivor clusters, moving slowly, possibly preparing to interfere with rescue. Mason acknowledged and broadcast a warning to all picket ships. The Callahan's main battery swung to cover, not to attack, but to protect. Radar-directed fire laid down a curtain of high explosives to shield survivors from the enemy boat. Roar confirmed a direct hit. Echo 9 was gone. Smoke hung in the air above decks and searchlights swept the sea, directed by CIC coordinates. The radar scope no longer looked like a battlefield. It was now a map of salvation. The radar crew had become guardians in the dark. Brody, soaked with sweat, whispered what they were all thinking. They saw the enemy first and saved what they could. The screen flickered again. The night had nearly passed. The blackness softened into deep blue haze, but down in CIC there was no sky, only the constant pulse of screens and scopes. Roar, hunched over his station, sipped from cold coffee. His voice was hoarse. Most survivors had been accounted for. Fletcher and Hudson were sweeping up the last of the wounded. The sea had gone still until the screen twitched. A blip appeared, irregular, where none should be. Roar adjusted his settings and caught it again, a faint, intermittent pulse. He reported a submerged return, possibly a periscope or snorkel mast, bearing 2110, range 8,000 yards. Mason joined him immediately. Brody confirmed passive sonar detection, but no active pings. It could be a submarine using the confusion to get in close. Roar fine-tuned the radar again, and saw it. An unnatural wake, narrow and deliberate. It wasn't debris. It was a sub, shallow and moving on a parallel course to the picket line, likely preparing for a torpedo run at sunrise. Mason speculated that the enemy believed the radar crew too exhausted to catch them, but they still had eyes below. Captain Thurston was informed. No depth charges had been deployed yet. Surprise was critical. If they were wrong, they'd give away their position, but if they let the sub get close, it could be fatal. Mason made the call. He ordered the sub's course plotted and depth charges prepped. Callahan and Hudson would bracket the target in 60 seconds. A tight beam alert was sent on quiet comms. Roar's hands moved quickly, mapping the sub's crawl toward the task force's southern arc. The CIC crew worked in focused silence, each man locked into his role with precision. It was like threading a needle underwater, except the needle had teeth. The spread pattern was confirmed, and Hudson on their 5 o'clock was ready to fire. Brody gave the go-ahead. 2 destroyers turned toward the Phantom. Moments later, the Callahan's stern racks thundered as cylinders the size of oil drums plunged into the Pacific and exploded in a rising series of deep, final blasts. The radar screen reacted immediately. The faint contact vanished. Nothing surfaced. No wreckage, no fireball, only silence. But in the CIC, that silence was an answer. She was real, Roar said softly. Brody stared at the plotting board. They'd sent her to finish what the kamikazes hadn't, and they got her first, Mason replied, his voice flat but proud. Above, the crew wouldn't know for hours. The sky would begin to lighten, the smoke would drift, and the survivors would realize they'd made it. But below, where the radar men kept their ghostly vigil, the true outcome had already been measured. Another threat eliminated before it could strike. The sea calmed. The echo of the depth charges faded into a low hum in the hull, and a strange stillness settled in the CIC. But no one relaxed. Fatigue clung to them like oil, thick, slow, and dangerous. Roar blinked at the screen, his eyes dry and twitching from too much caffeine and too little sleep. He'd been tracking signals and shadows for 9 hours, though it felt like days. Brody's voice had gone hoarse. Mason looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single watch. Still, the radar turned, the screen swept, and at 0450 hours, just when hope started to rise, a new contact appeared. It was a single surface return bearing 065, range 11,200 yards, speed 6 knots. Roar's voice was thin but clear. Mason asked him to repeat. A single contact, moving too slowly to be a fast boat, and not showing any friendly identification. It wasn't one of theirs. Brody ran the numbers. Speed, range, and angle didn't fit anything expected. It could be a suicide boat, one of those drifting explosive craft disguised as debris until the last moment. There were no friendly ships in that direction. Mason asked if the lookouts had spotted anything. The bridge responded that it was still too dark. They saw nothing. Only the CIC could see it. That truth held weight. They were the only eyes in the dark again. The contact moved steadily toward the bow, closing. Inside 10,000 yards. Roar gave the recommendation for action. The Callahan had minutes. Fire control locked onto the surface target designated Echo 12, relying entirely on radar. No visual confirmation. They were going in blind. Up top, Mount 51 turned to face the blip. Below, the CIC crew made fine adjustments, correcting for swell, drift, and minute changes in radar return. Target range decreased, 8,400 yards and closing. Still no profile. Brody observed it was deliberate. Mason agreed and ordered decisive action. The first 5-inch shell fired. Its arc was unseen in the night, but the echo of impact on steel was unmistakable. The radar return flared and split. Roar reported a secondary explosion. Ammunition detonation. It was an armed suicide craft. Brody confirmed it. They'd tried one last run in the dark, but it ended before it began. The explosion above was a flash across the sea. Nothing else was seen. With the final threat destroyed, the CIC exhaled together. Mason gave the order to stand down from general quarters but keep the radar active. He told the crew to rest. They'd earned it. Roar slumped back in his chair, letting the green glow blur before his eyes. His back was stiff, his stomach churned, but they had done their job. They'd seen the enemy first, every time. Because of them, 1,000 sailors would see the sunrise. The dawn broke slowly. A pale orange edge crept across the horizon, turning the Black Sea silver and revealing the wreckage. Smoke still curled from the Lud Key. A half-submerged lifeboat drifted near a scattered debris field. Damaged ships moved across the picket line, listing, smoldering, but still afloat. Inside the Callahan's CIC, the radar screens finally dimmed after 11 relentless hours. The team began to rotate out. Roar shut down his console with shaking hands, not from fear, but from exhaustion. His mind buzzed with static and instinct, but he was still upright. They had witnessed so much and still never laid eyes on the enemy. Brody took off his headset and stretched. The crack of his back echoed loud in the quiet room. He muttered that if he saw another radar echo that night, he'd start naming them. Mason gave a rare smile and told him he probably saved more lives than the gunners had. There was a pause, then Roar asked if the crew above even knew what they did down there. Mason didn't answer at first. He walked over to the narrow porthole slit where a sliver of morning light painted the sea gold in flame. He said they didn't have to. They were alive. That's what mattered. On the DRT board, a final acetate sheet was pinned, showing everything. Where the kamikazes came from, where the torpedo wakes were tracked, where survivors drifted, where the submarine crept, where the suicide boat died. A story told in pencil lines, math, and seconds. No medals would go to the radar operators, no war movie would show the silence under the deck, but every ship still floating owed something to those invisible hands. The next shift arrived, red-eyed, silent. Mason straightened up and turned to Roar, telling him to get some rest. He'd need sharp eyes again tonight. Roar nodded and stepped out into the corridor, blinking at the shift from green glow to golden light. Above, the sea was open again. A new day had begun, but down below, deep inside the Callahan, the radars kept turning, quiet, tireless, ready for the next ghost to appear. They couldn't see us, but we saw everything.